I don't think I was fair to them. But I don't think, I mean, I know all my ex-wives personally.
When Kenny Rogers died, the headlines rushed to count numbers, records sold, awards won, arenas filled across continents, but inside that final room, none of it mattered anymore. There were no stage lights warming his face, no crowd waiting for one last note, no applause chasing him toward the exit. There was only breathing, slow at first, then careful, then thin, each breath sounding like it might be the last one willing to stay. He had spent his entire life singing about choices, about knowing when to hold on and when to fold, about understanding that every decision costs something. Yet in those final moments, there was no music left to soften the truth, no melody to hide behind, just silence pressing in, heavy and honest. Kenny had always believed silence was safer than regret. If you didn't say the thing out loud, maybe it wouldn't hurt as much. Maybe the loss would stay manageable. But loss doesn't disappear just because you refuse to name it. It waits, quietly, patiently, sometimes for decades. Friends later said he wasn't afraid of dying. What scared him was time. Time he could never negotiate with. Time he couldn't buy back with success or rewrite with another verse. Moments that never made it into lyrics. Conversations that never happened because the road was always calling. For years, audiences thought they knew him, the gambler, the storyteller, the man with the calm voice who always sounded in control. But the real story was never about confidence, it was about cost. Because for every song that made millions feel understood, there was a choice that made someone else feel left behind. And in that quiet room, Kenny Rogers understood that truth better than anyone ever had. Kenny Rogers didn't grow up dreaming of fame or spotlight. He grew up dreaming of enough. Enough food on the table so dinner didn't feel like a question. Enough space so silence didn't feel crowded. Enough money to stop worrying about what tomorrow might take away. His childhood home was loud, tight, and unforgiving. Privacy didn't exist, and neither did comfort. In that kind of place, you learn early that survival means movement. If you stand still too long, life steps right over you. So Kenny kept moving. From one small job to another, from one responsibility to the next, always forward, never settled. Music wasn't love at first sight. It wasn't romance. It was escape. A way out of rooms that felt too small and futures that felt already decided. Every job he took taught him the same brutal lesson. Hard work didn't guarantee safety. It only delayed fear. The fear of being stuck. The fear of never leaving. When he finally bought his first guitar, it wasn't a sentimental moment. It was strategic. This wasn't a hobby. This was an exit plan. A door cracked open just wide enough to imagine something better on the other side. And once he tasted attention, real attention, there was no turning back. Applause felt like proof that the struggle meant something, that the nights of worry hadn't been wasted, but success came fast, too fast for a teenager who had never learned balance. By the time Kenny understood what fame demanded in return, it was already asking for more than he could afford to give. And that was the deal he would keep paying for the rest of his life. Kenny didn't walk into marriage prepared. He walked in scared of responsibility settling too fast. Scared of being ordinary before he ever had the chance to become something more. Scared that if he stopped moving, even for love, the door he had just cracked open would slam shut forever. Marriage didn't feel like a beginning to him. It felt like a test he didn't know how to pass. Love arrived at the worst possible moment, right when his career demanded everything he had, and instead of choosing one path, he tried to carry both at the same time, the dream and the duty, the stage and the kitchen table. It never works that way. Dreams are jealous. They don't share space easily, and they demand attention when real life needs it most. Bills piled up faster than hope. Arguments replaced promises that once sounded simple and sincere. Every night away from home felt like a betrayal to someone, either the family waiting or the future he was chasing. There was no version of the day where everyone won. Kenny told himself he was building something permanent, a future that would justify the sacrifices. But what he was actually doing was leaving people behind in the present, and presence, once missed too often, turns into absence people learn to live without. By the time reality caught up, the damage had already settled in. Love doesn't wait patiently for success to arrive, and resentment grows quietly, fed by disappointment and silence. When his first family slipped out of his life, Kenny convinced himself it was temporary, that he would fix it later. That time would soften the hurt, but later never came, and some doors don't close loudly, they close forever. The higher Kenny climbed, the quieter his personal life became. Fame filled rooms, but it emptied homes. Tour buses replaced kitchens. Hotel rooms replaced bedrooms. Life turned into a series of unfamiliar ceilings and borrowed time zones. He learned how to live out of a suitcase long before he learned how to stay on stage. Kenny was admired, applauded, understood. Off stage, he was absent. And absence has a way of becoming permanent when it shows up too often. Music rewarded him for leaving. Every mile traveled came with cheers. Every packed venue felt like proof that he had chosen correctly, but every return home reminded him of what those choices had cost. He convinced himself this was the price of greatness, that someday, when the career slowed down, everyone would understand why he had been gone, that the success would explain the silence. But children don't understand charts or sold-out shows. They understand presence. They remember who showed up and who didn't. And presence was the one thing Kenny couldn't schedule between flights and sound checks. As the hits grew bigger, the distance did too. The gap between who he was on stage and who he was at home widened until it felt unbridgeable. Guilt became something he carried quietly, like an extra instrument no one could see, but one that never left his hands. Fame had given him everything he dreamed of. It just couldn't give him back the time he had traded to get it. When the gambler took over the world, most people assumed Kenny Rogers was playing a character, a storyteller wearing wisdom like a costume. But he wasn't acting, he was confessing. The song didn't succeed because it sounded clever or catchy. It worked because it was true. Painfully true. The Gambler was never about cards. It was about choice, about knowing when to stay in situations that slowly drain you, when to walk away from things you still love, and when to accept loss without asking for another hand. Audiences heard life advice wrapped in melody. Kenny heard a mirror every time he sang it. The words landed closer to home. By the time the song became a global anthem, he already understood what it meant to lose something you couldn't win back: time, family, moments that no amount of success could replace. Each performance felt less like entertainment and more like accountability. The song didn't just define his career, it explained it. It justified the years on the road and exposed their costs at the same time. Fans cheered because they felt seen. Kenny stood center stage because he had lived every line. That's why the song aged so well. It wasn't written from imagination, it was written from experience. Long after the charts moved on, The Gambler stayed. Not as a hit, but as a summary. A reminder that life keeps score whether you're paying attention or not. And that some lessons only arrive after the hand is already over. With Dolly Parton, there was no competition, no pressure to impress, no pretending to be anything other than what he already was, in a life filled with expectations. Dolly offered something rare: ease. She saw Kenny clearly, flaws included, and still stayed. Not to fix him, not to change him, just to stand beside him. Their connection worked because it was honest. There were no unspoken contracts or imagined futures. No illusions of forever that later turned into disappointment. What they shared was respect, humor, and trust. In an industry built on ego and image, that simplicity was powerful. They sang about love, and the world tried to turn it into romance. But what they shared was deeper than attraction. It was understanding. The kind that comes from knowing someone's past without needing to rewrite it. Dolly didn't need Kenny to be more present, more perfect, or more available. She accepted the version in front of her. That acceptance became a safe space. A place where Kenny didn't have to perform or apologize, where silence wasn't heavy and laughter wasn't strategic. In a life full of complicated relationships and unfinished endings, Dolly was simple, and sometimes simple as survival. For Kenny, that mattered more than any chart position, because after decades of choosing the road, it was rare to find someone who didn't ask him to choose at all. When Kenny Rogers became a father again later in life, something inside him finally shifted. Time didn't feel abstract anymore. It felt loud, urgent, unforgiving. Every passing year carried more weight because he knew how fast they disappeared. He had already lived long enough to understand that childhood doesn't pause for success, and memories don't wait for perfect timing. He couldn't undo the past. He couldn't rewrite the years he had missed or the moments that never happened. But for the first time, he understood that showing up now still mattered. That presence, even late, was better than absence forever. This time, he made a different choice. He chose home over highways, morning routines over midnight sound checks, quiet Saturdays over roaring crowds. It didn't erase regret, nothing could. The guilt was still there, settled deep and permanent. But it softened. It stopped being a wound that bled and became a scar he could live with. He wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. Not to the industry, not to the audience, not even to himself. He stopped chasing legacy in the traditional sense. He wasn't thinking about how history would remember him. He was thinking about how his children would. That shift changed everything. Fame became background noise. Success lost its urgency. What mattered was being there, fully, consistently, for the first time in his life. Kenny Rogers wasn't measuring days in applause or miles traveled. He was measuring them in ordinary moments. And those moments, simple and unrecorded, became the most meaningful work he ever did. As his health declined, Kenny Rogers finally slowed down. Not because he wanted to, but because his body made the decision for him. The road had taken its toll. Every mile he had traveled came back as pain. Years of standing under hot lights, sleeping on buses, and living on schedules built for younger men had added up. For decades, he had outrun stillness. Silence made him uneasy. Rest felt unearned. Now, forced to stop, he didn't know what to do with the quiet. His body, once reliable, began to fail him in small but constant ways. Joints stiffened. Energy faded. Recovery took longer than it used to for a man who spent most of his life moving. Stillness felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable. It left space for reflection, for memories he had pushed aside, for choices he had justified instead of questioned. Pain has a way of demanding honesty, and Kenny listened. That slowing down gave him clarity he never had on the road. He could finally see the full picture. Not just the success, but the sacrifices. Not just the wins, but the losses that came with them. Fame hadn't protected him from time. It had only distracted him from it. And in that clarity, he understood something simple and unavoidable. The body keeps score, and eventually it collects. What matters then isn't how far you ran, but what you were running toward in the first place. When Kenny Rogers' final recording surfaced, it didn't feel like a release. It felt like a reveal. There was no rollout, no dramatic announcement, no sense that it had been carefully timed for impact. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost cautiously, like something that had been waiting for the right moment to be heard. And when people pressed play, they understood immediately why it hadn't come earlier. There was no performance in it, no polish, no attempt to impress. The voice wasn't chasing perfection anymore. It was softer, a little worn, carrying the weight of years rather than the confidence of charts. What came through wasn't technique. It was truth. The kind that only appears when there's nothing left to prove. It wasn't a goodbye to fans, even though millions heard it that way. It was a goodbye to the life he had lived, to the endless roads, the constant motion, the belief that there would always be time later. Each line sounded less like a lyric and more like a reckoning. Not dramatic, just honest. And maybe beneath it all, it was a farewell to the parts of himself he never fully forgave. The choices he made when he was younger and afraid. The moments he missed and the people who learned to live without him. The song didn't ask for understanding. It didn't ask for absolution. It simply existed, calm, unapologetic, final. Some songs are meant to wait because they aren't about the moment they're recorded. They're about the moment they're finally ready to be heard. And this one arrived exactly when it was supposed to. Kenny Rogers left behind a catalog of songs that will outlive generations. Melodies people will hum without knowing where they first heard them. Lyrics that will still feel familiar decades from now. But his real legacy doesn't live on vinyl or playlists. It lives in something quieter. It lives in lessons learned too late but learned honestly. In the understanding that success can't replace presence. That applause fades faster than memory. That love, when postponed too long, doesn't always wait. His story wasn't about getting everything right. It was about realizing what mattered after getting some things wrong. In the later years of his life, he gave love differently, more intentionally, more patiently. Not because he was wiser by nature, but because time had taught him what ambition never could. He wasn't trying to rewrite his past. He was trying not to repeat it. Kenny Rogers wasn't perfect. He never pretended to be. He was human, complicated, often conflicted. And maybe that's exactly why his music still works. He didn't sing from victory. He sang from experience, from choices made and consequences faced, from roads taken and others left behind. That honesty is what people still connect to. Not the fame, not the image, the truth inside the songs. Because in the end, the greatest gamble he ever took wasn't on stage. It was choosing to tell the truth about his life, even when it hurt. And that is a gamble worth remembering.